why don't do you mind starting with a prayer?
Sure.
Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and we shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to interact, to dialogue, to discuss things of eternal consequence. We ask for your Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us in this conversation, for humility and goodwill and illumination from you and your Spirit, that we may be true disciples of your Son Jesus in the promotion of the vitality of your church and its unity. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay. So I wanted to start by saying how impressed I am with your beard. I think that's probably the first place that I had ever heard of you. Was I think somebody created a Twitter poll or something like that one time and included both of us in it. Was that you? I think it was, right?
I didn't create the poll.
No, not you. Somebody else did.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I think you were one of the people named in it for like who has the best Catholic beard or something like that.
Yeah, and someone won who shouldn't have won.
Okay.
I think it was like, I think they had more cool points, but I was like, come on, that's not, I think it might have been, I don't know.
Keep it focused on the beard. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was probably at the time when I had tried to grow my beard out a little bit, but I don't know anything about curating something like that. I have no experience with it. And I also found too that the amount of time it took me to try and just groom in the morning, and not to look like great, but just to not look like Charles Manson when I walked out the door, was just between the hair and the beard, it was way too much. So I had to pick one or the other, and the beard.
Well, you've got, is your beard curly like your hair?
Yes, it's super curly.
Mine's not. It's a little wave, but it's pretty straight. It's not too tough for me.
Yeah, and if you look at any beard tutorials, they don't talk about curly hair, or at least they don't seem to, the way that they recommend using all the tools of the trade. So, yeah. So you're doing a good job there. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. And my wife, I've got to say, my wife actually is a big fan of your channel.
Oh, cool.
And she said, it's just men with beards I can trust. So you got to keep at least a decent amount of it.
Yeah. Well, I figure it will stay. My plan is that as I age, I will be able to smoothly transition into something like a Gandalf, like wizened wizard look. I think that's probably the only way to gracefully age for men. So
yes.
So that's my hope, that I will be primed for that and ready to go when the time comes, or just gradual transition towards it. So thanks for sitting down with me and having this conversation. Why don't we start a little bit about you and your background, if you don't mind? I don't know much about your history. I've seen some of your content online, so I'm somewhat familiar with you that way. But what's your faith background? Were you raised Catholic? Are you a convert? What's the story there?
So yeah, I am a cultural Catholic by birth. Okay. My mother's an Italian immigrant. My father is from a long line of Catholics. Actually, they were English, so I think they were pretty fervent for a while because they kept the faith during that whole history there. But nonetheless, we didn't practice growing up. Went to Catholic school, but the schools aren't so good nowadays, so didn't learn much and all that sort of thing. Yeah. And in my long story short, but just sort of in my mid-20s, I was recently married to my wife, and I just sort of had a conversion. Conversions happen all slowly and all at once. It's a long story and a short story. And, but a major moment for me was, we had just found out we were expecting our first child, who is now 7.5, almost 7.5. And a week later, after we found out my wife was pregnant, I went to Mexico on a mission, and I went to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I went down as a very let's call it lukewarm liberal Catholic. I just was of the world, as they say, and didn't know much dogma or anything. I was all over the map. But I came back, a rosary extremist. I just came back in love with the rosary and the Virgin Mary, and I was a different person. It really was an authentic conversion. And then from there began the journey, and in pretty short order, I sort of took the faith extremely seriously. I'm the type of person that, for better or for worse, I go all in on things. When I was an agnostic, I was an obnoxious Joe Rogan bro supporter kind of guy. And then I became, a religious zealot. And so I read a lot, and I just really took it seriously. And so by the time 2-3 years into it, I kind of discovered Catholic tradition, and into my conversion. So by about 2017, late 2017, early 2018, I was thinking I wanted more. I was in the charismatic renewal. Okay. Nothing but love for my friends and stuff that did that. That's great. It's just not for me.
Yeah.
But
that was my starting point as well, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
Which is why sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's like,
that's okay.
It's easy to get hung up on these dichotomies between tradition and like charismatic movements and in the way that the faith is expressed. But while I don't agree with that expression, I still recognize that there are sincere people of supernatural faith in the charismatic movement. Like, they need formation, but they produce a lot of very traditional Orthodox Catholics in the end, for people who continue in that trajectory of conversion, I find.
It's funny. You're exactly correct. My experience has been, for the most part, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, when I went full trad, and we'll get to the whole SSPX thing, but when I went when I came out of the closet as a traditionalist, I found that my charismatic friends were much more open to hearing what I had to say, and even many of them kind of crossed over and kind of started being traditional as well. Whereas I found my sort of, let's say, non-charismatic but conservative friends were much less open. And I don't know why, but I have my speculations. Like you said, the supernatural faith. When you talk to a charismatic Catholic, they're like, hey, I should probably ask God what to think, And they're more, I think they're more humble in that way. And so it's not my thing, but lots of great supernatural faith. So, God bless them for it.
Yeah, that's become the fundamental criterion for me as of late. I mean, it's easy to have these subcultures and group identities within the church, as with any sphere of life within society. But I'm finding more and more that even though there are some external things that I can easily identify that might be distinct from where I happen to find myself culturally within the church, the thing I'm now looking for more than anything is that supernatural faith. Is it somebody who truly has encountered Christ and loves him as a result? And I think that we can be on different phases of that journey. I've been all over the map in my short time as a Catholic convert. And so I try to recognize that in other people and say that, you might not be where I am, and maybe I have places I need to go still yet, but if you truly do love Jesus, he's going to take you where you need to go in the end. So I think that's important for all of us to recognize as sort of that fundamental perspective. So you became a bit of a religious zealot, which is something I can relate to after my conversion as well. Where did you go from there?
So I was a Catholic school teacher.
Were you before your conversion?
Yeah. So I write about my conversion more in my book, Terror of Demons, Reclaiming Traditional Catholic Masculinity, in a little bit more detail. The book's not about me, but I kind of retell the story. Yeah. The reason I actually started considering the Catholic faith again was because I actually wanted to teach at the schools that I grew up going to, even though I look back now and my education was so poor in a theological sense and a moral sense. I really enjoyed my time. I've played football and had great friends and teachers and, had fond memories, lots of nostalgia. So when I was becoming a teacher, I wanted to go back to where I had that fondness. And my no-no, God rest his soul, was a faithful Catholic. He was like the last one, him and my grandmother, my father's side. And my football coaches in high school, they were faithful Catholics, as far as I could tell. And I just remember thinking to myself, even though I was so insufferable in my, arrogant, agnostic-y ways, I still had enough of a little bit of virtue to say, I probably don't know as much as them, considering they're much better men than me. I should probably give this Catholicism thing a try. So that was, as I was going into teaching, that was kind of all part of it. So I was a school teacher. I loved it. But it was really hard. It was really, really hard to be a faithful Catholic. In fact, I've never actually, I've told this, I think I've told this on air. I was actually officially disciplined by the Ontario College of Teachers for expressing my Catholic beliefs in the classroom. It was bad. They told me my Catholic beliefs were abusive. And that was the government of Ontario. Anyway, so I fought the good fight as hard as I possibly could. And then eventually when lockdowns and stuff hit, I was already kind of really stressed out and having a hard time and just trying to fight for Catholic orthodoxy in the classroom. And then when the lockdowns hit and I just couldn't get on board with all that stuff and just the way the kids were treated, and I just decided to try and find another career. And by providence, turns out I'm a half decent writer, and I was able to find job, sell books and find a job as a journalist and move on to something else.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this interview, but just a quick break to say thank you to one of my supporters, which is Real Estate for Life. If you're somebody who is thinking about investing or buying in a new home, this is obviously a huge decision, and it helps to have someone helping you along the way who aligns with your beliefs. That's what Real Estate for Life can do for you. They have a network of real estate agents who sympathize with Christian and pro-family values. So check them out, realestateforlife.org. And then eventually you ended up at an SSPX chapel. Is that primarily your community? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so the Google does not distinguish between debated canonical statuses of societies of apostolic life within the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So when you look up Latin Mass near me, it just shows you whatever is constituted as a Latin Mass on Google.
Right.
So I had no knowledge of what the Society of St. Pius X was. I was living in...
So you searched for Latin Mass.
I searched for Latin Mass.
That was your first step. Okay.
And there were a couple moments too, that I should say. I was also looking for some books at one point, and I went to this publisher called Angelus Press.
Yep. And
I found these books, and I was like, wow, this is like the greatest bookstore ever. What is this place? Because, it's like there's lots of classics. And then I found this biography of Marcel Lefebvre, and I was like, who is this guy? And then I looked him up. I'm like, wait, I'm supposed to not like him? Maybe I should read about him. I'm very countercultural in many ways. So I just was like, well, the mainstream's telling me not to like him, so that usually I don't listen to the mainstream. Anyway, but I just wanted a Latin Mass. And once I realized there was controversy, I found there was society was 20 minutes from our house. And then there was a Latin Mass community about 45 minutes to an hour away from our house. The SSPX is daily Mass, 3 Masses on Sunday, school, catechism, like it's a full functioning community. The traditional Latin Mass community was a Mass every Sunday at 3 p.m. And
like a diocesan parish? Or what?
Yeah, diocesan.
Yeah, okay.
It's very traditional wasteland where I live. Our bishop, God save him, he's just isn't really like tradition, let's put it that way. And so anyway, we went to the TLM community for a while, as I was trying to figure out this society thing, but it was always just there. It was right there. I'm like, this thing's 20 minutes. It would be really nice if I could just go there. And I was convinced pretty quickly that it was fine to go to the SSPX. There's a lot of documents from the church that make that very clear. This was also after Pope Francis had made it clear that they had faculties for confession, and I just using my reason, I thought, okay, I can go there for confession, but then if I stay for Mass, do I have to confess to the confessor, forgive me, Father, if I'm about to hear your Mass? It just very, I try not to be a legalist, and I was just like, this doesn't seem like it makes sense to me. So eventually we just made that switch to just going to the SPX. And as I said, I'm very much an all or nothing kind of guy. And I realized, okay, we were actually going to the SSPX sort of on the down low for a while because we were involved in these catechism groups in our diocese, and we had all these wonderful friends. And we sort of dipped our toes in the waters and said, what do you guys think about the SSPX? And we got the craziest answers. One priest said to us, oh, they're like the Lutherans. They have no sacraments. One said they're like the Orthodox. One catechist, she said they don't recognize that there's been a pope since Pope Pius X. And I was like, whoa, all these answers can't be true at once. And I just realized that it was so sensitive amongst people. So we just sort of didn't really make it a thing for a while. And then what happened was...
Didn't make talking about it?
No, and we just everyone knew we went to the traditional Mass.
Okay.
And we just went to the Mass. Whatever, they don't know. And then we would just be a part of all our friendships, and it was great, like business as usual, good times. And then when lockdown hit, we had been going to the SSPX for consistently for like 7-8 months at that point. We had transitioned from going to the TLM community, which we went to for about a year and a half, 2 years. And then the bishops shut down Mass faster than the government said you had to in Ontario.
Yeah.
So our chapel was still open for 2 or 3 weeks after the churches had closed. And we just invited people to come to the Mass. We thought they might want to go to Mass on Sunday. And it all hell broke loose. You know, it caused a stir. And in fairness, tempers were really high at that time because it was a really crazy, it was a crazy time.
Yeah.
But it's sort of, at that point, you know, we either had to like defend ourselves or not because of the accusations and things like that. And I just was like, well,
this is just from within your Catholic community of
friends. Yeah. Like I lost speaking gigs and stuff for being a traditionalist, you know, like I was supposed to be on this men's conference circuit and things like that. Anyway, but I just was like, again, I'm a very loyal person. I have a lot of faults, but if I'm on your team, you'll be happy I'm on your team. And if I'm not on your team, you'll be unhappy that I'm not on your team. Let's put it that way. And I defended it. And I was like, well, I'm in a corner, so I'm just going to learn everything I possibly can. So now I'm at the point where I have a book coming out in 3 weeks on the SSPX.
Okay.
So it's kind of the Cole's Notes of it.
Cool. What has been your what's the depth of experience with the society for you? Is it mostly relegated to your local chapel, or have you had opportunities to get a broader view of what it's like within the society as a whole? Yeah,
so I mean, it's international. So I mean, like I've been to a few places, but I mean, Canada's also huge. So I mean, it's like 3 hours in between chapels, and then it's like 3 provinces in between. You know, But I'm also very heavily involved. Like I'm a member of the Third Order. It's like it's like the Third Order, Dominicans, etc. Like there's one in the SSPX. I have spoken, you know, at conferences and things like that, on the new Mass or like on liturgical things. And we held a men's conference to our Holy Name Society about a month ago, from our chapel. So I'm very heavily involved. Like I'm all in. And my experience has been, it's just been the greatest thing that's ever happened. You know, of course, hey, Judas was there with the first 12 priests, right? With the first 12 bishops. Obviously, if you hang around a group of people long enough, even if they're literally chosen by Jesus Christ, you know, they might have a bad day. But from what we came from in the diocese, in the normal sort of parish, and our parishes weren't even that bad. Like it wasn't like I had a terrible experience. It wasn't like utterly scandalous all the time. That wasn't the reason why we were looking for tradition. We just kind of wanted the fullness.
Yeah.
And then when we found it, I just realized, oh man, what we were missing, you know? And so it's been the greatest thing, the greatest friendships, the most earnest people, and I'm just really happy about it.
So it's probably worth saying then, though, that you're not like an official apologist for the SSPX or anything like that, right? Like, no. So
I don't get paid by them to talk about it or anything like that. No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. I'm often accused, at least in the comments on my videos, of being like a paid lackey for the Catholic Church or something like that, which is not the case for me either. So like, I'm not a representative. I'm not a spokesperson for the Catholic Church. I'm just a guy with a YouTube channel, and that's probably fair to say about your status within the society as well. So the reason I point that out for my sake, I'm not going to speak for you, but for my sake, I mean, I get things wrong. I'm not an expert in everything, all things Catholic. I'm just a layperson doing my best to try to understand and live the faith and communicate my experience to those who are interested in it. So is that, do you want to qualify your role at all in the society, or?
Sure. Yeah. I don't like speak. This is not like, you know, an approved ministry or something like that by the SSPX, or no, I just, I'm a Catholic author, and I have a YouTube channel, and one of the things that I'm most passionate about is the SSPX.
Yeah. Okay. Would you say you're pretty fluent though in what it is that the society believes and teaches? And okay.
I'm actually, like I said, I have a book coming out, hopefully by April 3rd, and it's a 270-page defense of the SSPX.
Is that something that you have to put past authorities within the society at all? No,
No, it's just I've consulted like canon lawyers that work with the SSPX and priests just for their input. But it's really just a work of love, just of support for the priests that I just don't want to see unfairly maligned. And I just did it out of gratitude, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's really similar to what motivates me to do what I do. So
yeah.
I can relate to that. So obviously the SSPX is a point of intrigue for a lot of people, especially on the internet, when we have just seemingly unlimited amounts of knowledge that we can sample and try to make sense of. My own forays into understanding the SSPX, I wouldn't say are that in depth. Like, I've tried to get a sense of it, but when there's like a million different directions you can go in life, if you have a sense of direction that is working for you, you don't tend to go looking for other options. You know what I mean? So that's, as a Catholic, that's often been my experience. I've always had sort of an option that I can continue to help lead me towards conversion and aligning my will with God's. So my cursory looks at the SSPX, I've often taken a bit of a, I've read a few articles on Lefebvre, and I might have listened to a podcast at one time or another about the society. And it's never inspired me to want to go any further than that. Mm-hmm. So all of which is to say that I'm not fully on board mm-hmm. with what I understand the society to be, but I'm hoping that this will be a productive conversation to kind of get a sense of where we have common ground. With all of that said, though, like before we jump all into that, I was kind of hoping that you could just share a bit about your sense of what it means to be a Catholic, like sort of the fundamental common denominator that we have between us. So, for example, like, why should somebody be Catholic instead of like Protestant or Orthodox? Is that something that you think you have a clear idea about in your own mind?
Yes, there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So that's a pretty good reason.
But if you were talking to a Protestant who believes in like sola scriptura, or an Orthodox who believes that we are the Catholic Church, right? Small c Catholic. Like what do you find persuasive in those kinds of conversations?
Okay, so so the Orthodox question is so much more difficult than the Protestant question.
Sure.
Because even Francisco Suarez, one of the great late scholastics, for example, he said that Orthodox believers aren't actually outside of the Catholic Church. And he had a point. I'm not saying that that's the dogma. What I'm saying is, when I look at how he was writing with his mode of philosophy, he was basically saying, because, okay, here's what it is. When you appeal to what it means to be in the church, there's three aspects. There's unity of faith, which is primary. That's the most important thing. There's unity of sacraments, so attending the same sacraments. And there's unity of governance. So that's the three prongs. You go through all the church fathers, all the theologians, the scholastics, whatever. This is what you come up with. Cardinal Below was a great Thomist under Pius XI and Pius X and things like that. And he was an incredible theologian. And there's a treatise from him that sort of disseminates Thomas Aquinas' work on the subject. And that's the three prongs that are known by all. The thing is, those three prongs, though, they have three. There's an external form and an internal form. So this is like when the debate comes up of, well, is, Joe Biden goes to Mass. Is Joe Biden Catholic? Well, externally, yes. Externally, he is Catholic. He says the Apostles' Creed while he's at Mass. He goes to a Catholic sacrament and he recognizes that the bishop is his bishop. It's very simple. On the other hand, internally, does he express the Catholic faith? It would seem like he doesn't, just because of the policies. We can follow these examples with numbers of people. So unity in the church is very simple, but then there's also a personal aspect to it. So this is why the Orthodox question is so difficult, is because if you were to ask an Orthodox person, they would believe they were under the rightful governance of the church, so it's very individual. With Protestants, they have no sacraments, and they don't really have government. So even if they do have a portion of the shared faith, they reject fundamental realities of what it means to be a Catholic in the church on principle. So, yeah, I guess. And then if I was talking to a Protestant, I mean, the historical arguments I find are the strongest. It's like, how does it come 1,500 years later? I just have never understood that. You've got to sort of go over a lot of church history to get there. And then let's look into some of the things Luther actually said He said a lot of really crazy things
Right.
at his table talks.
Right.
That's kind of how I approach it, I think.
What about on the question of like authority though? Like, so for Protestants who say, well, we agree Scripture is divinely inspired and it's an infallible authority. Why can't we just use that going forward? Because obviously, they might not say, well, there was no church for the first 1,500 years, but slowly it was degrading through corruption. Traditions of men were creeping in and things like that. So we all agree Scripture is great. Why don't we just stick with that?
Well, I mean, you'd have to get rid of the authority that put the canon of the Bible together, and why don't you take the Ethiopian Bible, right? The Ethiopian Orthodox have the Book of Enoch. And there are some Ethiopian Orthodox who are now in communion with the Catholic Church, which means some Catholics have the Book of Enoch. But again, where is the authority to come down on that? That's there's a very functional aspect to it.
Yeah.
And then by their fruits, I mean, let's be honest. For all the problems in the Catholic Church, there's one. For all the benefits there may be in Protestantism to some people, there's innumerable denominations, and they're always fighting with each other. So I just think it's from that perspective, it's pretty clear. Yeah.
Have you had opportunities to talk with Eastern Orthodox believers, and has that ever been productive in your experience? Like, so there's a lot that we can mutually recognize, right? We recognize that there is apostolic authority in the church and even hierarchy, but they kind of lop the head off of the hierarchy there. So have you ever gotten to that point in a conversation with them?
Yes. One of my really good friends is Serbian Orthodox.
Okay.
We believe like literally all the same things. And about the Pope, he just has a perception of the Pope that isn't really what the Pope is, but he believes it. So there's one of those aspects where I go, I don't know, you believe it. I guess you'll be judged on what you believe, and the ignorance is only, we're all ignorant in some ways, but that's up to God to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to come back to like the marks of the church, like according to the Nicene Creed, like one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, right? So it's expressed visibly, and it functions as a visible unity, right?
Yes.
It's holy, obviously it's holy, right? It needs to be set apart from the ways of the world. It's Catholic, so there's a universality to it. It's not a covenant with one nation or one people. And it's not just one particular set of doctrines. It's the whole deposit of the faith that we always need to maintain and believe and adhere to. And then, of course, it's apostolic. There's a clear authority that Christ gave to his followers, which we understand to be the apostles, and which succeeded down through generations, because it wasn't intended to be a revelation or divine authority for one generation, but for every generation that would proceed from there. So
I agree.
There's a lot of conversation you can have from this west. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but
no, you're right. Yeah, I mean the historical argument, the functional argument of the actual authority of the church, and the the visible marks, I think, are the strongest.
Okay. Yeah. So let's turn over then to the SSPX a little bit here. So where's the best place to start when you have an opportunity to talk to somebody? Is it like the history of the society?
Sure.
Or is it, maybe start there?
So I would start with, before we even get into the ideas of schism and things like that, I would just start with the persons. And the reason I say that is because if we're going to accuse people of schism, I'm not saying you are, but if one were to accuse someone of schism, right, it's actually a heinous crime. So we better be sure. Right? So basically I would start with who was Marcel Lefebvre. So he was born in northern France, and a lot of people don't know this. He's from a family where both of his parents were third-order Franciscans, and they had 8 children and 5 joined the religious life. So he came from a very devout family, and all of the children that joined the religious life, I think all of them, became missionaries. And his mother, you can read her spiritual letters between her and her confessor, and it's pretty clear she was actually a stigmatist. If I may speak so boldly, I believe Marcel Lefebvre will be canonized one day, but I think his parents will be like Remy and Zélie Martin. He raised 8 kids and 5 became wholly religious, and the dad died in a concentration camp as a volunteer for the French resistance fighting the Nazis. As an old man, he was 50 or 60 at the time, and he joined as a spy. They attended daily mass. They had a tradition in northern France at the time so that everyone could follow Pope Pius X's recommendation to receive communion often, that they would go to Mass, or it wasn't Mass, it was every quarter of an hour, it was like communion. So basically the prayers around the communion and then the prayers after, you spend 15 minutes just receiving Holy Communion, kind of like happened during lockdown if your priest would see you for communion. And that was what they did every single day. And then they would go run their factory where they employed, a bunch of people in the town. And he grew up he actually lived 15 to 20 minutes away from one of the battlefields in World War I. And he grew up in World War I. And what happened to his family was no, he was 11. He was born in 1905. So he was like 11 or so when it started, I think, or 9 or something. But it was so bad that actually his mother was a prisoner of war because she was caring for wounded soldiers. And I believe it was the occupying forces because she was caring for the French. I think that's why they put her in the jail. And she was treated so poorly that, and she was so malnourished that her spine started to decalcify. And she had to wear a back brace for the rest of her life and could never really sit properly and had to lay down or stand and was in constant pain. And if you read her spiritual writings, it seems very much that she was like a victim soul, offering her sufferings to the cross and finally received the internal wounds of the stigmata. So that's the family he came from. The reason I bring that up is just because it seems to me that this is a man from a family that is, quite literally saintly. And eventually he became a missionary. He was a missionary in Africa for 3.5 decades or so. In fact, Cardinal Sarah, his family, was converted by the Holy Ghost Fathers, which was the order Lefebvre was in, while Lefebvre was in Africa. So I don't know if they ever met. And it was in the same country he was in. So the Holy Ghost Fathers converted Cardinal Sarah's parents away from worshiping totem poles to being the parents of Cardinal Sarah. So it was an amazing order. And eventually he was the apostolic delegate for French-speaking Africa, sort of like a massive mission diocese. Millions of people under his care. Church grew like crazy under him. So it's funny, people talk about the strength of African Catholicism. A lot of that is actually the work of Marcel Lefebvre. He was beloved by Pope Pius XII, and then eventually after the Second Vatican Council, he retired. He was a conservative, of course, and there was sort of the battle between the modernists and the conservatives during the council. And he fought valiantly with Cardinal Ottaviani, Cardinal Bacci, these sort of big players. Cardinal Ottaviani was actually the head of the Holy Office at the time, the head of the CDF, and they were close friends. And he was just an older man. He was in his mid-60s, and he said, "Okay, I fought," or he was 61 or something, and he said, "I'm going to retire." Then a group of seminarians actually approached him from France who had to leave their seminary because the French seminary in Rome during the general elections in France was flying the communist flag. And they said, "We wanted to go to the seminary to become Catholic priests, not communist." So they basically pulled him out of retirement, and he was reluctant, eventually agreed to start a seminary after they tried many things, started a seminary. It was a Society of Apostolic Life erected in Switzerland with the seminary, and the rest is history. And that's how we got the SSPX. So this is the background. I like to tell it because there's this perception that people have about Lefebvre and the SSPX as if it was this sort of renegade operation. But really the history is kind of the complete opposite if you actually look at it. Okay,
so that sounds like a pretty wholesome history from what you've described so far. So where does the controversy arise?
Good question. Okay, so before I begin with the controversy, there's a frame of mind that I think is helpful when discussing what we're about to discuss as far as the suppression of the SSPX. Okay. We know from Christ that when we judge things from a legal perspective, we must, of course, use the spirit of the law to animate the letter of the law. And when we don't have that, we run into problems. That's just something I think keeping in mind is important because we are going to get into some sort of canonical conversations. And canon law, just like secular law, is a complete and utter web of confusion, and you can have people on all different sides of the equation giving seemingly logical, impenetrable arguments that are completely in contradiction of one another. And you'll find that with people talking about the SSPX. There are people who... There is one canonist. He's the dean of canon law for St. Paul's in Ottawa. It's one of the only two official canon law degree granting universities in North America. And he has written a piece where he believes the SSPX was validly suppressed in 1975. And then there are contrary pieces by similar men in the world, and priests and things like that, who are canonists. And so anyway, so the new mass was promulgated in 1970, and they wouldn't say the new mass. Lefebvre would not say the new mass. And before people think that's an extremely renegade position, before the new mass was officially promulgated, there was something called the Ottaviani Intervention, which was a short critical study of the Novus Ordo Missae. And that was put out by Cardinal Ottaviani and Cardinal Bacci as the main authors. And again, Cardinal Ottaviani was the head of the Holy Office at the time. He was the world's chief doctrinal expert. And they were very critical of the new mass. And Lefebvre was on this as well. He was part of the intervention. They were so critical, and I'll sort of paraphrase, but if you actually read it, it's a very striking document. You can't imagine something like that being written today. And it was basically questioning whether or not the Mass had any Catholicity in it. So then when the Mass was promulgated, there was what was called the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. We still have this today. Every time there's a missal, there's a general instruction that goes along with it. Obviously, for a long time, it never changed because the Mass didn't really change enough to need a new instruction. The first instruction for the Roman Missal that came out in 1970 has since been destroyed and is no longer in print. You can only find it if you can speak French. And there was a fellow who in the Vatican ended up photocopying it, one of the last copies. This was known to all the bishops at the time, though, and what they said about the new Mass, this was from Rome, was that it was primarily a meal where the priest presided over the celebration, and it did not mention the intent of the Mass to be a sacrifice. This doesn't mean the Novus Ordo is invalid, but this was just what they were imbibing as the instruction, and this was from the architects of the new Mass. So there was a lot of controversy about it, and Lefebvre just said, I'm not going to say this Mass. I'm 60-something years old. I've always said the old Mass. I'm just going to continue saying Mass as I've always said Mass. And he trained his seminarians to say the old Mass. In 1974, there was a visitation from some visitators, which is a technical term for visitors from Rome for seminaries and things like that. And they went to the SSPX seminary. There was rumblings that it was a renegade wildcat place. The French bishops did not like the seminary. Most of them were very liberal. Lefebvre was always despised by many of the French bishops because he was so conservative, but he spent most of his career in Africa, that he wasn't a problem for them. And so there was a smear campaign. It was actually very much like a sort of Marxist smear campaign in the newspapers and things. So anyway, they sent visitators. What's going on at this seminary? And they had a glowing review, an absolutely glowing review of the seminary. But there was one problem. The two men who were not cardinals, but they were from some congregation from Rome, they had scandalized the seminarians. One of them actually was saying to a group of seminarians, sort of mocking the idea that there was a bodily resurrection of Christ. And it was very scandalous. These, of course, I mean, you're trying to be a priest of Jesus Christ. That's kind of a big deal. And so Lefebvre was horrified for his seminarians. So what he did is he wrote what was called a Declaration of Faith. And it was never supposed to be published, but it was. And the Declaration of Faith it said things like, we adhere to eternal Rome and not the Rome of the neo-Modernist tendencies. Now, this caused a huge uproar. And as an aside, the word eternal means always. So people will say Lefebvre only adhered to Rome before the council, but eternity would include after the council. I've never understood why people can't make that distinction. So it doesn't actually mean, anyway, That's a linguistic thing. But it caused a storm. So then there was a move to have the society suppressed. And the main contention was that Lefebvre would not say the new Mass. And we know this because the night before he performed the ordinations of priests, in light of suspension, an ambassador from an ambassador from Rome, so the priest who was sort of like, I guess, like a nuncio for Switzerland, he came and he said, "I have a new mass missal with me. Just say this mass and everything will go away." And his response was, "I'm sorry, but I've already said mass today." And that his logic was essentially that the old mass had never been abrogated, so you can't say I'm supposed to say the new mass instead of that one. Fast forward to 2007, and what does Pope Benedict say? The old mass was never abrogated. And he actually, in a sense, sort of castigated this idea that it was, and said very plainly in that letter Summorum Pontificum that it was wrong to say that it was, and that it never was. That was sort of a vindication of Lefebvre. So from there, though, now at this point, the SSPX is operating under suspension. Now, the reason I sort of mentioned
this is after the declaration, or after
this is after they did the ordination of priests in 1976.
Okay, right. So
sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, was it the whole society, or was it just Lefebvre that was suspended from sacramental function, or?
So the seminarians had they were not ordained yet, so
right.
they were lay people technically.
Right.
Although, there's differences with the old orders with subdiaconate and stuff. But anyway, they were when they were what's the word I'm looking for here? When they were ordained, they were ordained illicitly by the letter of the law, which means that you're suspended.
Okay. So he had been suspended prior to the ordinations.
Yes.
Oh, I thought that's what had caused the suspension, was the ordinations themselves.
Well, actually, no. Maybe you're right. So what happened was the society had been suppressed. Okay. So you're right. You're actually right. You're right. Yes, the society had been suppressed.
Okay.
Now again, we can't spend.
And that was just by the local bishop, right?
Yes. It's way more complicated than that, though, because there's
Rome
so
was
much
involved, obviously, but yeah.
Rome was involved. Pope Paul VI was involved, but we now know Pope Paul VI was actually operating off of false information, because when the meeting minutes of Pope Paul VI and Marcel Lefebvre from 1976 have been released, and Pope Paul VI said, "You make your priests take an oath against the Pope,"
right?
And he said,
"That's right."
Well, it never happened. Yeah. So anyway,
didn't the Secretary of State make that accusation directly? Is that where I'm trying to remember?
That's from Cardinal Benelli. You're talking about Cardinal Benelli with Lefebvre.
Maybe. I don't remember what his name was, but the Secretary of State of the Vatican was the one who had directly accused him. I thought directly, in front of him, to Pope Paul VI, that he
recorded the meeting. I don't know if he said it. Okay. But you're right. That's Cardinal Benelli. Yes, he was the Deputy Secretary of State. Cardinal Villot was the Secretary of State, and Cardinal Villot, Lord have mercy on him, he turned out to be one of those men who sadly was very cozy with Freemasonry. They found out from the investigation by Cardinal Gagnon. But anyway, so lots of craziness. So this is
a crazy time.
Well, maybe this would be a good opportunity to talk about the idea of a crisis in the church, because it really is difficult to talk about the SSPX without at least agreeing on what a crisis is.
Okay, we're definitely going to get there, I think. So maybe let's hold off on that for just a sec. But
sure.
Okay, so history-wise, we're up to the point where
we're 1976.
Lefebvre, at least we know, is suspended. The society has been suppressed by the local bishop with the endorsement of the Vatican and the Pope himself, I believe. So obviously things are now controversial at this point.
A little bit,
as far as its status goes.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. Let's keep marching forward just with the history, and then we can maybe backtrack a little bit and address some of these points.
Sure. So this suppression, Lefebvre tried to appeal the suppression, and Cardinal Villot would not hear he was the Secretary of State. He would not hear it. Anyway.
He did have a sympathizer, though, didn't he? Wasn't there somebody in one of maybe the Congregation for the Religious or something who?
Yes.
Okay.
Cardinal Wright.
Okay, is that who it was? Okay.
Cardinal Wright had written. Again, the confusion about the legal status of the SSPX was so confusing from day one. Nothing to do with what Lefebvre did. It was just different. So, but Cardinal Wright was the prefect for the Congregation of Religious, I believe.
Okay.
And he said it was an exemplary order and all these sorts of things.
Okay.
And Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's fine.
anyway,
We don't have to get hung up on that point.
yeah, it's all in my book, by the way. It's coming out
Okay.
in 3 weeks or so.
Okay.
And he was, so they operated just, and at this point, they just operated as the SSPX under the guise of suppression. So that was pretty much the way it was until 1987. And then at that point, Lefebvre was suffering from, it turned out he was actually suffering from a pretty severe bowel cancer that took his life a couple years later. And he had been in negotiations with Rome for a bishop.
Right. A successor to himself, basically.
Well, so sort of. So Lefebvre, the SSPX is a Society of Apostolic Life, and it has a superior. It's not necessary that the bishop be the superior be a bishop, and actually, it's preferred that he not be.
Yeah, the current one isn't a bishop.
No, Dom Pagliarani's not. No, the first one wasn't, and the second one was, and the third one's not. I think that's how it is. It was to ordain priests.
Right.
It wasn't for any jurisdictional reasons. The bishops of the SSPX, they just perform confirmations and things and ordain. They don't, have a diocese or anything like that. Right. So basically, they went back and forth with Rome for a lot of conversations. He was discussing mainly with Cardinal Ratzinger. He had presented numerous candidates for the episcopacy to Rome at their request. And 2 or 3 different times, he was told to go ahead and then reschedule. Go ahead and reschedule. And eventually, in May 1988, he reached an accord with Cardinal Ratzinger.
Yeah, they signed like an agreement or something, right?
They did, yep.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a very interesting agreement because a lot of people will say, the SSPX is schismatic because they don't accept Vatican II. But in the agreement, it literally says, I got to accept these couple parts, but we can discuss the rest.
There were huge concessions from the Vatican in that agreement, from what I understand, right?
Yeah, on doctrinal stuff.
I think just across the, they said that you can carry on with the 1962 Missal. I don't know I'm not familiar if anything was discussed on the Second Vatican Council, but you can have a bishop, you can continue to operate the seminary with, it sounded like quite a bit of autonomy, and continue with the 1962 Missal. Sort of,
yeah. At that point, it was the 1962 Missal had been sort of liberated. With a letter under Pope John Paul II in 1984. I don't remember what the letter's called.
But just that they could there wouldn't be any pressure on them to celebrate the Novus Ordo, basically, is what I understood it to be.
No, there wouldn't. And basically, the model that was presented was something like what the Opus Dei has.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, I don't think the term personal prelature was used yet, but it was basically a personal prelature. Eventually, that was an offer that was explicitly made in 2009 or 2007, but there was a cardinal in Rome who kiboshed that. Anyway, so here's the thing. In the agreement, it was not actually agreed that they would have a bishop explicitly. Okay. It was agreed that they needed one.
Okay.
It's a different thing, especially when you're dealing with the Vatican in the second half of the 20th century, which has been a very interesting place.
Didn't they want a bishop though? What
they did?
No,
I'm saying the SSPX wanted one. What I'm saying is Rome said, you need one.
Right. Okay.
Not saying that you will have one.
Okay.
There's a big problem there because Lefebvre at that point had been burned a few times in these negotiations, saying go ahead, don't go ahead, go ahead, don't go ahead. And he basically just said, okay, if they are going to agree to this, I'm going to call their bluff. So this was May 6th or whenever the day was. And he wrote a telegram, I guess it would have been, or something like that. And he said, I'm going to go ahead with the consecration of my bishops on June 30th, since you've agreed that I can. And they said, oh, no, you have to wait. Please wait until, November, etc. And he realized they're just not going to give me one. And Cardinal Gagnon, who was the most trusted man in Rome, he was actually the first person that John Paul II asked for when he came out of his coma after he was shot. John Paul II's first words out of his coma were, find Gagnon. The reason was because Gagnon had told John Paul II before he was almost assassinated that there would be an assassination attempt, which he had found out through his investigations into the Freemasonry in the Vatican. And
so this was like a prophetic thing. It was just
he was just telling the truth. He was just like
intelligence that they knew about. Yeah.
Cardinal Gagnon was the most earnest man in Rome, and actually Cardinal Gagnon was the man that John Paul II sent because he trusted him so much. He was the man who John Paul II sent to Rome, or to Econ, to be with the seminary for a while, to do a thing in 1988. Mm-hmm. And he wrote in the guest book for the seminary, and you can still read it, and he said, hold fast this treasure of the church that you have, who was Marcel Lefebvre. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is, this is, to go back to the suspension thing, Cardinal Gagnon was there in Econ for I think it was the Immaculate Conception. And at the Immaculate Conception, the seminarians they make pledges, like vows to sort of continue. It's called something, I can't remember. But anyway, it's a common thing in traditional seminaries. Maybe it's still new ones, I don't know. And he sat there in his episcopal garb through a pontifical high mass celebrated by Marcel Lefebvre with seminarians making a vow to be priests for the SSPX as an official visitor of Rome, which is very scandalous if you think about it. I mean, if you're suspended, this is why I say it's been very confusing since the beginning, because on the one hand, a letter says one thing and then the actions of Rome say another. Because technically, if Lefebvre was a suspended bishop, what he did was, by the letter of the law, mortally sinful.
The ordination, specifically?
No, just celebrating Mass publicly.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, I mean, it's very grave if it's real, right? And Cardinal Gagnon was fine with it. So, I don't know. And fast forward, Marcel Lefebvre consecrates 4 bishops, along with Castro Mayer, who was a bishop from Brazil, from the Diocese of Campos. And they consecrate the 4 bishops, and not as bishops with jurisdiction. They didn't have a diocese, as auxiliaries. And after that, it was not John Paul II who leveled the excommunication at them. That's actually not true. John Paul II's letter was 2 days later. There was a letter from Cardinal Gantin, who was a French African cardinal, who was the head of the Congregation for Bishops. And he said that Lefebvre and the 4 bishops had excommunicated themselves because that's called a lete sententia excommunication.
Right. Didn't Paul VI say something to that effect at one point, though, after the original ordinations, that if you do this, it will be a lete sententia excommunication?
No. Under the 1917 Code of Canon Law, consecrating priests is penalized by a suspension. Okay. And that was the code used until 83. So if he said that, it was, I don't know, it was just... I don't think he did, but it wouldn't have had any weight to it because it wasn't the law. The Pope can change the law; he can, sure. But he has to act under the law while it's still the law. So would
you say that the Pope is judged by the law then?
Well, this is actually something that's baffled theologians for a long time.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, for example, if the Pope makes a decision, appeal is impossible.
Right.
But on the other hand, Pope is subject to canon law, meaning the Pope can't just go desecrate the Holy Eucharist and get away with it. Because that's a canonical crime.
That's also divine law. Obviously, that would be a very, very grave.
Sure, but it has a penalty. So yeah, sure, it's a bad thing. But what I mean is,
I think as Catholics we have to exercise a certain degree of faith, though, that whoever is chosen to be Pope and whoever is Pope would be preserved from doing something like that. From abandoning the faith, I guess is what I mean.
Yes. Yeah. But history gives us some crazy examples.
Of sin, certainly.
Of sin, yep.
Yeah.
But public acts of scandal that are objectively against the faith. I mean, the pornocracy in the Vatican in the Middle Ages and the prostitutes and things like that. I mean, these were things that happened and everyone knew about it. I mean, I guess it's not the same thing as desecrating the Eucharist, but it is a grave scandal against heaven and earth to the public, considering it's the Pope. And then also there was Pope Honorius, for example, who was condemned by an ecumenical council or Vigilius. I get them mixed up by the successor. So, I mean, yes, the Pope is the vicar of Christ, and obviously is a very big deal. But the extent to which he is impeccable is debated by a lot of people.
Yeah, obviously we don't expect impeccability. I guess the enduring question for me though is that we have this thing called law, canon law within the church, and it is enforceable. The degrees with which it is enforced sometimes vary based on the degrees of fortitude that persist in the church. But it seems to me that canon law, as with any law, requires somebody to interpret it, right? Like in secular law, we have judges who will, they'll hear a trial and they'll say, okay, yeah, no, obviously this person, if found guilty of it, deserves a certain just penalty based on the transgression of that law, right?
Yep.
So in the case of the church, you need someone higher than the Pope, I would think, to interpret that law.
I see what you're saying. Well, so let's put it like this. The Pope is subject to canon law in the sense that he has to use it as it's written until he changes it.
Okay.
So in that sense, the law is the law that's the law, and he has to use that law and not just kind of make it up. So in that sense, he's subject at least to the confines of the law. How he's penalized, I have no idea. I mean, I have no idea. But I'll also say this. If you read the old manuals for interpreting canon law from before the 1983 code, they would still be valid today. It was just they were talking about the 1917 code, and this was very clear. And I cite this in my book as well. If the Pope were to make a decision, but it turned out that it was based on falsehood, even though the penalties would be felt, it wouldn't be valid. And it's very simple logic, meaning, even let's use a secular analogy. The greatest judge in the land of the Supreme Court sends a man to prison for murder, but he didn't actually commit it. It's like, well, he's in jail, but he's not actually guilty. And so no one can make goodness into badness or badness into goodness or justice into injustice, that sort of thing. It's the law of non-contradiction. So with the case of Marcel Lefebvre, if we find that the suppression was invalid for legal reasons, there's an argument for that. I'm not going to make it here, but there is then that would apply. On the other hand, canon law is a human law. It is the positive law of the church. It does contain divine principles, but in and of itself is not infallible, which is why it can be changed and adapted. So take two striking examples. So before Pope Pius XII, it was not required to have the Pope's papal mandate for the consecration of bishops.
Right.
But he changed it, and do you know the reason why?
No.
It's very telling for our day that we're in right now. He changed it because the communists the communist Chinese government was having them ordain communist bishops.
Yeah.
Fast forward to our day, now the Pope sadly has given the communist Chinese government the authority to select communist bishops. So the reason he changed it was not because it was intrinsically wrong at all for someone to consecrate bishops without a papal mandate. There's no intrinsic evil in it whatsoever. It was to avoid bad bishops from being consecrated.
But it does reflect the nature of the hierarchy in that the mission of the church extends through bishops, right? Like, so priests are an extension of the ministry of a bishop, and to some degree those bishops are an extension, well, this isn't probably an accurate description of it, but they acquire their mission through their communion with the juridical and apostolic authority of the Supreme Pontiff, right? So it would make sense that canon law to kind of reflect that in a certain way, I think. Okay, so among the contentions of the SSPX, we've got obviously the new Mass. There were some theological contentions as well. On the question of the Mass, is it the Society's position that the Novus Ordo is invalid then? Like it's
no,
okay,
not at all.
So what is the position then, or is that all there is to it? Like it's not as good a liturgy as before, and
sure,
there must be more.
This is a really good question.
That, right?
Pardon me.
There must be more to it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay. You're exactly correct. So this is a really good question. To answer this question properly, we have to understand the history of the liturgy, just the Cole's notes in the church. Yeah. So the reason why we have reform is because it is believed by whoever's in a position to believe it or to decide that there would be a better way of doing the liturgy. That's really what it comes down to. It doesn't mean the one
reform.
Liturgical reform, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why you have reform. You know, some people will say, you know, you can never criticize the Mass. It's like, actually, technically, a reform is it's at least a critique.
Definitely,
okay?
Yeah.
So, the problems with the new Mass, according to the Society and virtually all traditionalists, and I would say the Fraternity of St. Peter, at least in its inception, would have the same opinions because they never said it either and don't say it. And in fact, this is a good little side note. Father Bissig, who I believe is the superior for the fraternity, I think he still is. I think, I'm not sure if he was at the beginning in 1988, but he, the fraternity priests that were with the SS were fine with operating after the suspension. They believed it was unjust. They just weren't fine with consecrations. But so this idea that you could operate after a suspension is not some sort of crazy idea that no one accepts. It's pretty common for during a crisis. Anyway, but so the liturgy. What's the problem with the liturgy? Well, so
we don't have to do a whole deep dive.
No, but I just want to give their basic Cole's notes of what they think. It's basically that there's a Protestant spirit imbibed into it.
Okay.
Which is obvious because it very much resembles the Anglican service and it very much resembles the Evangelical Lutheran service. And we know that it does because after it was promulgated, Evangelical Lutherans said this is like a traditional Lutheran Mass. Well, it's not a Mass, but you know what I mean. And the Anglicans said that this is actually less. Basically, it's less traditional than a high Anglican service.
Right.
And then Taizé accepted it, this sort of pan-Protestant Catholic movement in France. And this is what the Cardinal Ottaviani said in the Ottaviani Intervention and things. And it was basically like, this is a striking contradiction that seems to not even really be in line with what Council of Trent said about liturgy. That was kind of the contention. So it's not that the new Mass is like objectively harmful, like you get some sort of cooties if you go to it. That's not the point. Okay. The point is that because it imbibes a Protestant understanding of sacrifice, that over time your faith will be sucked out of you. Okay. That's the idea. And that
Am I wrong in saying that, like,
sorry
to interrupt. Hasn't there been some sort of a statement, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't know if Lefebvre said this or maybe somebody else subsequently said that, like, the Novus Ordo was intrinsically evil. Is that not true?
No. Because that would be impossible, because if the consecration takes place, there's a good there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So again, it's not like the actual SSPX was not formed because of like liturgy snobbery or something. And one of the evidences of that is they still use the 1955 Holy Week. Many traditional Catholics that are not in the SSPX think that the SSPX is like compromising with the modernism because they use the 55 Holy Week, and their reasoning for that is they do believe the pre-55 is objectively better, right? But they say, but the 55 is not harmful to the faith, does not present a danger to the faith, and it's a valid reform, so we're going to follow it. So that's that's the same way they look at the Masses. It's not about our Superior General of Canada. He put out a letter last year, and he said if the Pope wants to make the Mass into a different language, as long as it is not a striking break with what the Mass is supposed to be, this is completely fine. It just hasn't happened.
Sure, and I don't know this, but I imagine, like, Lefebvre was at the council, so on documents like Sacrosanctum Concilium, he signed on to that, I imagine, hey?
Yes.
And I mean, that's what it pretty much says, that the vernacular can be used in greater amounts.
Lefebvre said, he did not say the new Mass. Lefebvre said and this is in his biography, he said a French translation of the Old Mass one time as an experiment, because they were asked to try these things. And he said an Old Mass facing the people one time. He hated it. He just felt so vulnerable and just like didn't want to be a performer. And he did say, until about 1970 something, it's loosely called the 1965 Missal, where there were a few prayers taken out, like they didn't say the Judica Me, I don't think, and they didn't read the epistle and the gospel at the altar in Latin. They only read it at the pulpit. Okay. And then like the Our Father was said in the vernacular. He did say these things. He had no problem with liturgical reform. It just after time, he just looked around and he said, people are losing their faith and their primary contact with the church is at the Mass, and they're believing Protestant things. there must be a correlation here, and just believe that it was dangerous to continue with it.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I think we can see around, and we look around and we go, listen, many good Catholics in the Novus Ordo. Of course there are.
Yeah.
But in Canada, I think it's 15% of Catholics go to Mass on Sunday, and half of those don't believe in the real presence.
Sure.
We have problems, and the new Mass is at the heart of it.
Yeah. I do think that, let's call them reformers or just contemporary modern day Catholics, or those who sought changes within the church, which would include the Council Fathers, I think they do have a point, though, in making that we can make these distinctions between the spirit of Vatican II and the letter of the law, right? And I think most of us who are more conservative or traditional would say that the letter is much better than what was implemented. Whether we even agree with the letter, it's still much closer to what we think the church should have done. But that implementation was done by Catholics who were raised in a time when, if we look at a place like Quebec, when it was like 90% Mass attendance, which on the exterior looks like, wow, such a vibrant faith. But in fact, if they were willing to just walk out after the Quiet Revolution, many of who blame that on the reforms of the liturgy in the Second Vatican Council, it's like, well, what was the quality of that faith? I mean, maybe on the outside it looked substantial, but on the inside and through the implementation, these are the people, this is the generation that really botched that implementation, which I think we've made a lot of strides in the right direction since then.
Yep. Yeah, and you're right. And so I'll use an analogy. Well, let's look at history. Why did St. Pius X write the Oath Against Modernism in the early 1900s? Because he had to.
Yeah.
It was already there.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. So Vatican II, my friend Taylor Marshall, he always says Vatican II was the parade. It wasn't the lead up. It was the parade, right? Like this post-conciliar thing, it was already in the works. It was the coming out party, so to speak. Yves Congar, one of the most esteemed theologians, he said this unironically, Vatican II was the October Revolution in the church. Pope Paul VI he called it the church was in a state of auto-demolition. That was what he said in one of his sermons in 1974 or something like that. So this is an analogy I'll use. You're exactly right that, of course, there had to have been issues, because why would you just leave?
Right.
And I get that.
Or botch the implementation of the reforms.
Or botch it.
Yeah.
Well, as far as why they botched it, we can only speculate. It does seem like there's been a little bit of a sickness in some of the higher offices of the church, sadly. And this is not the first time in history. Yeah. We did go through the Arian crisis, and that was really bad. Yeah. They say 90% of bishops were at least sympathetic towards the heresy, so that's a problem. But for the faithful, I would say this, on the one hand, did they have the strongest faith? No, because they wouldn't have left. On the other hand, I'll use an analogy. You raise kids. Do you guys homeschool?
Yeah.
Okay, so do we. And there's a reason we homeschool. Because we have to.
Right.
And if my kids were really on the brink of like losing the faith, having bad morals or things like that, it'd be the stupidest thing ever to put them in public school.
Sure.
That's kind of what happened. It was like the fathers should have recognized that the faith of the people was very delicate, and the last thing they should have done was a radical change that was more secular. And that's kind of what happened. So sure, they were definitely, there's a personal agency involved of people leaving, but there's also a reality of the fathers should have never done that because it was the thing that pushed them over the edge, let's say. So I think it's a bit of both. Okay.
Just to kind of go on down the list of perceptions of the SSPX. So would you say you're in communion with the Pope?
For sure. I pray for him 3 times a day.
You recognize the authority of the Pope, and you're not sedevacantists or anything like that?
So the SSPX has never officially not been in communion with the Pope. And I'll explain what I mean by that. For one, the excommunications, which were argued to be invalid by Father Murray, who's a contributor to EWTN. He wrote his doctrinal dissertation saying that, and it was given the highest mark by, I think it was the Angelicum in Rome in 1996. Being excommunicated does not necessarily mean you're outside the church. And I can just quickly, because I don't want to mess up the citation here, but Robert Bellarmine says as much. And he says, it may happen that an excommunicated man retains his baptism, the profession of faith, and the subjection to the legitimate prelates, and thus be a friend of God, if his excommunication was unjust. So if the excommunication is unjust, which I believe it would be, then that's pretty simple. He also says, it may also happen that a man justly excommunicated does penance and has the above three, baptism, faith, obedience, before he receives the absolution, and thus would be in the church, even while remaining still excommunicated. What does this mean? You can't approach, let's just say even if you were just excommunicated, which I don't believe the SSPX was, I'm just, for the sake of conversation, if you seek to have, like, the Pope can't lift a penalty of you if you're not in the church. Because if you're not in the church, you're not under his jurisdiction. Okay. So when the bishops of the SSPX in 2009 had their excommunications lifted,
how could any excommunication be lifted then in that case?
That's what I mean.
Oh,
so you
okay.
have to be subject to the Pope. You have to be subject to the Pope at least in some way.
Sure.
Otherwise, you wouldn't seek his. Otherwise, you wouldn't seek his intervention.
Well, and seeking to be reconciled would be a submission back to the Pope, by which he could then lift that excommunication. I mean, right. This kind of relates to, like, say, the laicization of clergy, for example, right? Like, some people
are
have
still Catholic.
Yeah, well, not only that, but they're still technically, like, the ordination puts an indelible mark on the soul, right? So while they have no canonical status, they're not allowed to exercise the sacraments. They technically could consecrate
the Eucharist.
Yeah, exactly.
And danger of death,
they can hear confessions, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
I should add, though, but the actual SSPX itself was never declared in schism or excommunicated. The priests.
Okay.
So even there would have to be a distinction. If we were to take it letter of the law, there's no penalties on the priests, and there was never the same penalties, even in theory. So they were never not in communion with the Pope, because they prayed for the Pope in every Mass, and always had recourse to Rome and went whenever they were called. So, yeah.
So according to the SSPX's I don't know, let's say there's their declaration of faith, their statement of faith, not an official document or anything like that, but they understand themselves to be in communion with Rome and
100%. Yeah. Okay. Our local chapel is going to Rome for their grade 12 trip because they want to go see the Pope.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, so let's maybe jump back then to some of these finer points within the history. So you said that it wasn't, or did you say it wasn't validly suppressed? Is that right?
That is one of the contentions that I believe. Okay. And but again, it's a very large. We're talking about law, know. And one thing I've realized, I've covered a lot of legal cases as a journalist, and I've sat there, and I know that the government, for example, I think you and I would think similarly that a lot of the stuff that happened in the last 2 or 3 years was unjust by the government against people. Right. I've watched their government lawyers argue that what they did was legal to pastors who were arrested and things like that, and I've had to report on those cases. The legal arguments from the law, from the government are very sound, but they're based on an unjust principle. Okay. So it's possible for something to be legally valid but unjust, and I would say that you could argue that the suppression of the SSPX was legally valid but unjust, and you could also argue that it was legally dubious or invalid and also unjust, and that would be the position I would take. Okay. Yeah.
So, like, on the question of obedience, for example, as subjects to any valid authority, and we can maybe talk about this a little bit more, but like this is something that Aquinas is quite clear on, to whatever degree we accept him as an authority. But he says that we, just as in the natural order, higher things move lower things. So
that's right.
Within the order of the church, and he doesn't even necessarily say this about the church. He's talking a little more broadly that subjects need to be obedient to their superiors. Yeah. So in the case of the church, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought on this now.
Well, basically, what are the limits of obedience? What point?
Yeah, sorry. So the point being that if we are to be obedient, except for the fact that if a superior commands us to do something that is against the natural law or the divine law, then it's an unjust law or an unjust imposition, right? And at that point, you can disobey. So there are. Yeah. So is it your contention that the society was disobeying unjust laws or unjust impositions from, let's say, the Pope or otherwise.
Basically, and you know what? I'll use a contemporary example. Pope John Paul II did the same thing as a bishop. So in 19, I believe I have it right here. It was 19.
Okay.
He did consecrations of priests against canon law in Czechoslovakia at the time. Is it called Czechia now? Did they change the name from Czech Republic? Technically,
I'm not familiar.
I remember seeing that.
Czech Republic and
so did I, but I thought it changed.
Okay.
But yeah, and actually George Weigel, who was his papal biographer, said, yeah, he broke canon law, but it was for the fact that the Holy See had a policy of Ostpolitik, which was basically don't poke the bear of the Soviets, which actually was a smart policy. Sometimes traditionalists can be too hard on it, but when you actually look to, for example, under the Nazis, the bishops of the Netherlands had to tell Rome to cool it on the condemnation of the Nazis, because they were like, every time you poke them, we get whacked over the head. So just relax. So it was actually a smart policy, but they took it too far.
Yeah.
And so John Paul II, from a state of necessity, sort of disobeyed the law, but for the higher law, which would be the salvation of souls.
Right.
And then Cardinal Schlippi did the same thing. He consecrated bishops in 1976 against the will of Pope Paul VI in the Ukraine. And so this has happened before. And I would just say this would apply to Lefebvre, and they had a reason for it.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I'm not familiar with the latter instance that you're talking about. In the case of John Paul II, you could say he was circumventing or maybe going outside the boundaries of the law, but it wasn't in contradiction of, say, the will of the Pope at that time. Like, they found out about it, and they were like, no, that's okay given the circumstances that are there, right?
Well, it was in contradiction of the policy of the Pope.
Sure. Well, if that's what you want to say about the law, yeah. Yeah,
and then also, but with this example of Cardinal Schlippi in 1976, it was against the express will of Pope Paul VI. He consecrated bishops in the Ukraine. Sorry, you're not supposed to say the Ukraine. Ukraine.
Just Ukraine, yeah.
I don't want to get into the Ukraine-Russia sympathies here, but that's another rat's nest or wasp's nest or whatever. Yeah, that's the term. And so he this is actually from Father D'Souza, Canadian priest who's not a traditionalist.
No.
And he wrote, he said, Pope Paul VI would not give permission for the new bishops for fear of upsetting the Soviets. The consecration of bishops without a papal mandate is a very grave canonical crime, for which the penalty is excommunication. Blessed Paul VI did not administer any penalties. And this is referring to Cardinal Schlippi's consecration of bishops. And why did he do it? Because he believed the Ukrainian Catholics would be without bishops to continue the Ukrainian Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
And so there's other examples. There's one from the Middle Ages. Bishop Grosseteste, he disobeyed the Pope and would not consecrate his nephew. And he actually rebuked the Pope and said, because I'm a loyal son, I'm paraphrasing, he said, I am in my filial obedience, I disobey and resist. And he's seen as a hero of English Catholicism. There's a university named after him in England. So there are moments. And we really just have to judge those by history and see, was the man correct or not?
Right. So what then does judge those moments to know if they were correct or not? Is it an endorsement of the subsequent generations of the church, or are we left to our own interpretation about that?
Sometimes it takes centuries. Okay. Joan of Arc she wasn't canonized until 1925. She died as an excommunicant. Technically, it was unjust, though. We know it was unjust. I mean, we look back now, but put it this way: there was a cause for her canonization for, 5-7 centuries before she was canonized, and technically she was an excommunicant by the letter of the law. But we don't agree. We obviously don't believe that she was. With the case of what we're going through right now, we have to. I think at this point we do have to sort of discuss the idea of crisis, because we're living through a period of time, which many would say it might be more grave than the Arian crisis. I wish we had one heresy to deal with, Brian. Wouldn't it be nice if we just had Arianism to deal with? Then we could know exactly where people stood. But now we have modernism, which St. Pius X called the synthesis of all heresies, which would include Arianism. And this is an analogy I'll give because this is the best way I believe to understand crisis. So the Arian crisis, it was not a crisis because there was a heresy. St. Paul talks about heresies in the early church. We wouldn't say the early church was in crisis. It was a crisis because there was heresy and it wasn't corrected.
Okay.
So this is what I'll say. The church is the ark of salvation. We can compare it to a ship, right? This is a classic analogy. Well, if you go on the water, you anticipate certain risks. You might encounter storms, tidal waves, pirates, whatever. As long as the captain of the ship and his assistants and crew members do what they are always supposed to do and protect you from these storms, then you may have problems, but you don't have a crisis. The crisis comes when you ask the captain to do something and he's drinking rum and not going to get out of bed. And then at that point, you have the crew members who either have to act, in a sense, independently, or just go with the will of the captain, which is to, have dialogue with the waves rather than avoid them, or see if the pirates have a better way of encounter. Follow the analogy here. And the problem is that what's going to eventually start happening is that passengers are going to start jumping off the ship unless somebody does something. And they'll be lost forever because there's only one ship that's going to get you to heaven. Okay. So what Lefebvre judged was essentially that we were in a situation where we were in a crisis of leadership. And you and I, we can't do anything as laymen, really. I mean, we can make podcasts and hopefully people like them. I have no jurisdiction over the church. I can't consecrate priests. I can't hear your confession. I can't even really catechize you with the same authority that a priest does. So he judged the situation and said, we're at sea, and it doesn't even have to be the case that the Pope is a bad man. It doesn't even have to be the case that he necessarily is a heretic. It just has to be the case that he's not acting sufficiently to keep the people from jumping off the ship.
Okay.
And that was what he believed, and that's what many believe. This is not a minority position anymore. I mean, we look at the statistics, and there are many priests who we would call quote unquote full communion who would say the exact same things. I mean, Bishop Schneider is saying these things, and he's a diocesan auxiliary bishop. Cardinal Miller is saying these things. Even Benedict has said these things in his Benedictine way. God rest his soul. And this is not a crazy position to hold anymore. That we're in a grave crisis and that sometimes extraordinary action might be necessary. But there's certain things you can't do in a crisis. So, for example, if we go back to this analogy of the ship, it would be wrong to have a mutiny. It would be wrong to take the captain and throw him off the ship and say, I'm the captain now.
Okay.
That would be starting your own church.
Right.
But Lefebvre never did that. He just said, this is what I've done for 4.5 decades as a priest.
Yeah.
This is how I saw Africans literally go from worshiping totem poles to becoming Catholic priests in one generation. I'm going to keep doing this while the captain decides to have a dialogue with the pirates because people keep jumping off the ship, and and he literally said, his thing was, I'm not going to stand before God and at the end of my life and be told that I used my episcopacy to contribute to the destruction of the church. Okay. And that was his reasoning.
Okay. So let's bring this back then to the question of obedience.
Sure.
We do understand that it is lawfully divine and naturally and in human law and positive law that we do have to be subject to our superiors, right?
Yes.
Now, you've provided a couple instances in which there are examples where arguably there are people who stepped outside the boundaries of law, right? So if we took those as precedents, then what's to stop us from taking just any number of opportunities to say, well, the Pope said something that I don't like, that's unjust, therefore I don't have to obey it. Whether I'm a bishop, whether I'm a layperson, or just whatever.
That's a great question. So I would look to Thomas Aquinas, because I think both of you and I really respect him as an authority. Yeah. And he talks about this in his discussion of prudence, which is one of the cardinal virtues, right? Yeah. So the cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and what's the last one?
Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance.
Justice.
Did you say justice?
That's right. There you go. I didn't say it. You said it. I always forget. So they have to be illumined by faith, right? The cardinal virtues they're not supernatural virtues, but they become supernaturally supercharged by divine faith, faith, hope, and charity. So under prudence, Thomas Aquinas discusses the virtue of nome, which is spelled like garden gnome, but has nothing to do with garden gnomes. It's Gnome. Mm-hmm. Nome is basically a sub-virtue of prudence, wherein a wise man, illumined by supernatural faith, can discern the mind of the legislator when needing to disobey a lower law to obey the purpose of a higher law. So Thomas Aquinas uses the example of, and this is in the Summa, if you are someone who has a deposit, meaning you're basically a bank, and someone comes wanting their deposit back, by justice, you are required to give it back. Unless you have foresight to know that they're going to use that for, I think the example he says is an attack on the state.
Okay.
So if somebody, he's an arms dealer and he's going to go and, buy some nukes to get rid of Toronto.
Right.
You would not be sinning because you would be not giving his stuff back, which would be unjust to him, but would be just to your nation.
Right.
Okay. So the reason why I think we can say, for example, someone like John Paul II or Cardinal Schlippe or Bishop Grosseteste in the Middle Ages, or St. Athanasius or St. Eusebius of Samosate, he went around and he consecrated bishops with their own diocese during the Arian crisis because he said there were too many Arians in the cathedrals. And that's like miles ahead of what Lefebvre did. He gave them literal dioceses and that's like schism par excellence by the logic of the anti-SSPX crowd. And but he acted as healer, because he said one of the things as a priest is I have an alter Christus, I have to act as a physician, and the body of Christ is sick and nobody else is doing anything, I have to. But how could he have the foresight to say that it's okay for me to do this? Well, he had the virtue of nome, and history has judged him as having that virtue because the Arians were wrong. Lefebvre, again, if we go back to his upbringing, he was nobody doubts that knew him that he was a very saintly man. Nobody doubts this. So we have to look at history, where we are now, look at tradition in the Catholic Church and how important it is for people, and just what fruits have grown out of tradition. Okay. Look at everything he said would come true, and it did. Look at the SSPX itself. It has never gone into heresy. It has never gone into a parallel church. It has never transgressed any boundaries that people would expect a schismatic to do. And day by day, people become more and more in line with what seemed like radical positions of traditionalists 40 years ago. And I would say that Bishop Lefebvre had the virtue of nome, which in this sense is actually very accurate and is very specific, because he did know Pius XII very well. And Pius XII was the one who had changed canon law for the reasons of not consecrating communist bishops. And so I think he understood the mind of the legislator very well, knowing that I could do this thing and this would not be against the will of the legislator, because I knew what he meant. And that's how I would say it. Okay.
Doesn't that require us, though, then to be judges of who has this kind of wisdom that isn't maybe explicitly defined? Like, obviously, as Catholics, one of the things that drew me to the Catholic Church was this idea that there is an explicitly defined authority that I can look to, whether it be my ordinary or the Pope himself in his sort of apostolic teachings. Yes. But if we have something that's a little more vaguely defined, like this wise person who can interpret the law better than the person who is explicitly defined as the superior authority that we need to look to, that looks to me like a recipe for anarchy.
You 100% could be, which is why we'd have to look to the fruits of the thing. So the Society of St. Pius X, 50 years old, 53 years old. The new Mass is 53 years old. What are the fruits of tradition in the church? The normal fruits, and what are the fruits the opposite? Again, there are always exceptions. If you know about vineyards and things, amongst the bad crops, there'll be the odd sweet grape. Sure. But as a whole, you can't use that thing. Lefebvre was a traditionalist. His positions were just that of all Catholics for 19 centuries, for the most part. I mean, pretty mundane. Lefebvre was actually very moderate. A lot of people they look at him and they think he's some sort of extraordinary traditionalist. He was not. He was known as a moderate in his theological views. Like, for example, when he was in Africa, he was okay with African funeral rites as long as they took place before the liturgy started outside of the church, because it was their custom and there was nothing offensive to the faith. A traditionalist would be, I mean, I think you've spent time in traditionalist circles. You know, some people will be like, "Oh my goodness, what is this, Pachamama II or something?" But he had no problem with it because he recognized that there is this thing as enculturation, you know, and in the true sense. So the fruits of the SSPX have, I mean, it is now growing, and it's and that there's no risk of schism or anything like that, and tradition itself is thriving in the church, and we're seeing now, as it's being threatened, that it's obvious that this is causing great harm to people, and now you have priests who are not even people who say the Latin Mass. You have priests like Father Murray. Maybe he says it on his own sometimes, but he's not a traditional priest. You have cardinals. You have bishops of dioceses saying things that if Lefebvre said them in 1970, it was like, oh my goodness, this schismatic. How dare he say the Pope is blah, 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 blah. And now you can have a segment on EWTN and say those things, for goodness sake. So I would just say the fruits show that Lefebvre was in possession of this virtue. Whereas if you compare him to someone like Martin Luther, of course he wasn't. Because Luther also rejected all the tradition of the church, you know. So we can just use our reason and say, what was he standing for and what were the results? And I think with Lefebvre, it was pretty clear that it was just Catholicism.
I think part of the challenge with that, though, becomes that if we're trying to make the case for traditionalism, it becomes a little bit circular at that point, right? Like if we say, well, if you want to judge traditionalism, you have to look at the fruits. The fruits are great traditionalism, so that's why traditionalism is true. And I think that for unsympathetic ears, like you're right. That has a certain kind of rhetorical effect on me because I'm sympathetic, right? But I don't know if that's really going to convince a lot of people who aren't enamored with, let's say, the Latin Mass. Right? Well,
that would be true of all arguments for tradition, I think. Like, you know, right. Because I mean, like, I believe that the Novus Ordo poses at least a chance for scandal. And especially, like, here's the thing. For a time, I was okay if I had to go to the Novus Ordo because I couldn't get to that 3 p.m. Mass that I used to go to.
Right.
Okay, I'll go.
Right. Yeah.
I had to stop. It felt like I was weeping over Jerusalem every time I went. And this isn't because, like, I'm not some person who's special or whatever. It's just because I read books about the Mass, and I read books about the Anglican revolt and the Lutheran revolt, and I looked at the comparisons, and I looked at the construction of the new Mass, and I just thought, my goodness, this is like offensive. You know, it's not an indictment on the priests, it's not an indictment on the people. It's just, in good conscience, I just can't go.
Okay.
And you know, this is a position of traditionalists. This is a position of so many traditionalists. You know, a lot of people attend the FSSP or the Christ the King and stuff, but when they're on vacation and there's no you know, diocesan Latin Mass around, they might not tell anybody, but they're going to the SSPX because they hold the same positions. It's just where they go to Mass when they're home. And again, this is it won't be something that will convince people who aren't into tradition, but I don't know. You can't be everything to everybody all the time, so I don't know what to say to that.
I guess I'm still getting hung up though on this question of obedience to the Pope, because, like, I don't know how we can move forward with our understanding of ecclesiology as it's defined in Vatican I and certain encyclicals and things like that. That if we can say, well, I know the mind of the Pope better than he does, or I understand the tradition better than, let's say, the interpreter of the tradition. Then what's to stop, like, say, the James Martins of the world from doing these, or the German synodal way or whatever from doing the exact same thing, right?
Well, in their case, it's clear that they're heretics, or at least approaching heresy. Right. You know, I know it's technical. I know it's so, but that's not the case with the traditionalists, because every jot and tittle of the faith they believe. So it can't be a matter of that.
But do they? Well, okay, so when we're speaking of traditionalists, let's just confine it to, like, let's say the Society, or let's say Lefebvre for a second.
Sure.
Does he believe in this ecclesiology that recognizes that supremacy of the Pope, both in matters of faith and morals, but also in juridical matters in the governance of the church as well?
100%. That's one of the reasons why he had such problems with collegiality from Vatican II, because it seemed to be in contradiction to Pastor Aeternus. Right.
Yeah, like, he was an extreme
ultramontane
defender of But in practice, though, how do we refuse to then obey, let's say, the commands or the prescripts of a Paul VI or a John Paul II in that case?
Because as a pastor, you have to deal with both the practical and the hypothetical. And it's one thing for, I mean, listen, John Paul II talked to Lefebvre for like 10 minutes one time in 78, never again. He had no idea what was going on. And I mean this, and I have a friend who lived with Cardinal Gagnon, a close friend, and Cardinal Gagnon said to him, this was the expression in Rome. He was French, and he said, "Una chara regne." When the mouse is gone, when the mouse is gone, what is it? When the mouse is gone, the cat comes out. The cat is gone, the mouse comes out to play. There it is. When the cat is,
right,
that was, I mean, John Paul II made serious, egregious, juridical errors. He had a policy when he would travel that whoever was his assistant would be made a bishop as a favor. So what do you think happened? He got the Cardinal McCarricks of the world got so-and-so to be his assistant when he was visiting a city and whatever. We haven't even talked about the grave doctrinal problems that arose after the council, which were in complete contradiction to all of church history on various subjects like religious freedom. Which Reginald, I think you like Gary Goulagrange, correct?
Yeah.
He did a deep dive on religious freedom before the council. It wasn't for the council, it was in general. And he said if it's not a heresy, which he believed it was, it's at least an extremely grave error. And the fact that and this was from all the tradition of the church, and the fact that this was in the council documents, I mean, again, we talk about this unity of the church. The primary thing has to be faith. Unity of lies is no unity at all. So, there are so many problems on the sort of, let's call it the institutional framework, that sadly we're in a grave crisis, and Lefebvre did what he believed he had to and nothing more. And I think he was justified. And this is a paradox, isn't it? I love the papacy enough to stand up like St. Paul and say I resist him to his face. Because it's not about the man, it's about the office.
Right.
Pope John Paul II was going to pass. Pope Paul VI was going to pass. Francis is going to pass, whatever, irrespective of their legacies. The church will remain.
Sure.
So the dignity of the office must be held intact, which, if it's being abused or used unjustly, then for the sake of souls, there needs to be some sort of action. And that's out of love for the church herself, and it's not out of animus.
Yeah, but in order to do that, somebody has to make that judgment that it's being...
Yes.
It's being abused, or that there are bad decisions being made,
and
nobody can judge the Supreme Pontiff. Like that's the problem.
Yes, nobody can
admit
judge
as Catholics he can make mistakes, right? On matters of prudential judgment, right? But at the end of the day, it's still necessary for us to be obedient and to suffer the consequences of those, rather than say move towards something like schism.
Unless our faith is in danger.
So he can't command us to violate like a divine law or something like that,
or just doctrine. It's just not the case that religious freedom is compatible with Catholicism. Like, it's condemned out the wazoo for centuries.
Right. I mean, I'm trying to be cognizant of time here, because we could, we should go down this question of religious freedom, and I certainly have my concerns with it too. I have heard explanations about how we can reconcile that with the tradition that I think, okay, maybe that's workable. And obviously I'm not a theologian, and so it's getting into territories of nuance that I struggle with. But I think I can understand the degrees with which obedience is defined, and certainly something like schism is defined. So that's where I get stuck, right, is on this question of, I can understand how there can be theoretical scenarios in which if I'm familiar with the Pope, if I have a personal relationship with him, if he tells me to go and commit a murder, and it's clearly a murder or something like that, or if he tells me to renounce my faith in God, obviously I can disobey him in a scenario like that.
But I would just add, sorry, go on. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. Obviously I'm going towards, on the question of juridical governance of the church, like when it comes to ordaining bishops or priests or something like that. Even if my conscience tells me that I've got the better take on this, at the end of the day, we still have to be obedient to that legitimate authority, don't we?
That's not what St. Augustine thinks.
Okay.
And I'm going to read you something from St. Augustine here. And I will say, you're correct that in the explicit sense of, go commit a mortal sin, of course you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But this is sort of like when we get in debates with like leftists, and they'll say, if like they're or relativists, and they don't really believe in right and wrong, and you bring up, Hitler, the classic Hitler analogy, and they're like, okay, fine, he was a bad guy.
Sure, yeah.
And it's like, well, there must be degrees of badness between me and Hitler, There must be degrees of unjust commands between everything being hunky-dory and go murder somebody.
Yeah, yeah.
So the Pope couldn't even tell you to not say your rosary. Like even that would be like if he said you can't say your rosary. It's like no, I yes I can.
Okay.
He might say
like to say that it's wrong to say the rosary. Or something.
Yeah, or you're forbidden from saying your rosary. He cannot forbid you from saying your rosary.
Sure.
A father could not command a child under the age of 18 to not say the rosary.
Yeah.
He'd be completely justified in disobeying him because he's obeying a higher law. Right. So it's not just to these points where it's not just saying if the Pope asks you to explicitly do something bad, is that the Pope asks you to not do something that you know is good. Right? So we have to think about that. So this is what St. Augustine says about something. It honestly sounds like St. Augustine is talking about the SSPX. So I'm just going to read this quote in its full because I think it's very telling.
Okay.
And he says, sometimes, too, divine providence will even allow good men to be expelled from the Christian community through some outbreak of turbulence and discord on the part of the worldly-minded folk. When they show inexhaustible patience in putting up with such an insult or injury for the sake of the peace of the Church, and do not undertake any novelties in the way of schism or heresy, they will teach us all with heartfelt loyalty and genuine charity how we should serve God. The intention, therefore, of such men is certainly to find their way back once the tornado has subsided. But if this does not permit them, because the same hurricane persists, or an even more savage one would start if they came back, they will continue willingly to consider the interests even of those to whose agitations and troublemaking they have given way, without ever setting up their own separate conventicle, which is like saying a church, or to defend and assist with their testimony the same faith that they know is being proclaimed in the Catholic Church. The Father who sees in secret, Matthew 6:4, will in secret award these men their crown. This kind is rarely seen, but all the same instances of them are not lacking. Indeed, there are more of them than you could imagine. Thus it is that divine providence makes use of all kinds of men and women and their examples for healing souls and establishing a spiritual people. So the reason I bring this up is I agree with you, Brian. Like, you're exactly correct that one of the things as Catholics that we love is that there are just like rules and proclamations and, black and white. But the thing about black and white is that black and white does facilitate gray. You can't have gray without it. And there are times within church history, we haven't even talked about the Arian crisis, where there are men who stand up to, which are even otherwise good men, but just are sort of on the wrong side of a decision, even as popes. Yeah. And then just over time, through providence, and it hasn't been that long. I mean, 30 years since he died. It's the year I was born. 34 years. That's like 10 minutes in the Catholic Church. Yeah. I mean, again, how long did it take for St. Joan of Arc? And we just live in this period. And, what's going to happen in the future, I have no idea. But I do know, for example, that there's one a German cardinal. This is off the record, but it's been released. But I know this through my journalistic connections. His name is off the record, but the statement is not off the record. He said Lefebvre will be a doctor of the church, of the priesthood. Cardinal Ratzinger was recorded in a meeting with seminarians a few years ago, or 15, 20 years ago, saying Lefebvre was the most important bishop of the 20th century. These are opinions that are held by many important churchmen. It's just we haven't seen this sort of experiment of the post-conciliar era reach its logical conclusion yet, and we're still in, as St. Augustine says, not only was there a hurricane when Lefebvre was around, but the hurricane persisted, and in some ways it's even worse in some respects, which is subjective. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. So we're just not there yet.
I mean, what I hear in that quote though is a scenario where someone. So let's say there's maybe a local conflict and a bishop suppresses, let's say, a priest, since we're kind of dealing with an ecclesiastical concept here, and. Perhaps something like what happened to Padre Pio, for example, right? Who was certainly persecuted within his life. And that person suffers the suppression. It's unjust. but they never act out in disobedience against, say, the legitimate authorities, and perhaps they even die excommunicated like St. Joan of Arc. The consolation there is that God sees in secret their true heart and can judge them accordingly, right? But those of us who can't make that judgment, those of us who are sitting on the outside of that scenario, we still have to remain obedient, I would think. We can't, like, perhaps in 100 years from now, Lefebvre will be vindicated and recognized for the good work that he did. But in the meantime, those of us that don't have hindsight, it seems to me that we have to remain obedient according to our pretty explicitly defined ecclesiology.
Yeah, but except that the church has said we can go to the SSPX. So, like, it's not disobedient. So that doesn't really come up for lay people. Okay. If what you're saying is, I mean, really, I don't know how we could be disobedient.
Yeah, I'm not so much talking about like us as lay people, going to say like a chapel or something like that. But
yeah, we haven't even got to the point that where they have faculties. They have in 2015, Bishop Fillet was appointed as a judge by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for a priest in the SSPX who had to be through some sort of court. Well, that's impossible to do if he's some sort of disobedient or whatever. I mean, why would he do that? And there are many such examples. I mean, as early as 1991 or 1991, it was a few months after Lefebvre died. There was a bishop who tried to excommunicate a group of faithful in Hawaii for having consecration or confirmations done by the bishops of the SSPX. And Cardinal Ratzinger reversed it, and he said, no, there's no schism to attach yourself to. So my point with this is, if you really do your deep dive, the vindication insofar as him not being some schismatic is already there. We just live in this time of turbulence. So in a time of crisis, all you can do is just continue to keep your faith. And we must obey our prelates unless they work against our faith. I mean, if I'm speaking from experience here, but my diocese, like my bishop put out a letter. He's put out the same letter 3 or 4 times. He literally copies and pastes it with a new date on it. And he sends it out to various parish family communities when the question of the SSPX comes up, because some people start going to the SSPX from that parish. And he says he says you cannot go to the SSPX under any circumstances, and they are not in the church. And it's like, that's not true at all. I mean, that's just you could go to the Orthodox for some circumstances according to the church. So that's not even it's just like, that's the diocese I'm in. I mean, they canceled baptisms during lockdown. I mean, et cetera. We go on. So our obedience, and this, to go back to this example of Bishop Grosseteste in England in the Middle Ages, he said that he said the Pope himself, he accused Pope Innocent IV of disobeying Christ with what he was commanding him to do. This is, again, these things are very rare, and we would like them to be very rare. But also, we don't have any divine protection for juridical decisions by the Pope. This isn't like, it's not like speaking ex cathedra. These are matters of jurisprudence, and they can be incorrect. The purpose of law is to serve justice. And therefore, if justice is at stake, you go with the justice rather than the positive law. And it's really that simple. So I will say, though, I understand when people don't agree with the positions of the SSPX. That's cool. People have different positions. But we are in a position now where I think we have enough hindsight to say these are clearly positions that many people who are, quote unquote, in full communion hold themselves and are allowed to hold and are in line with some really good theology. So we're not in a position to anathematize or call people schismatics, which you're not doing. So I just think, yeah, for sure. Yeah, not yet. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're not going to start drinking on this, are we? Because, I know people who are like, I'm just going to stick it out in my parish. Yeah. And I'm like, you know what? I remember one time a buddy of mine saying, his daughters, when they were going to the Novus Ordo, and there was the female altar boys, and And he said, and his daughter goes, "Can I be a girl priest when I grow up?" And he's like, "I can never go back to that parish. I just can't, because I want my children to, to be Catholic."
Yeah.
That decision is something we all have to make for ourselves, and I'm not going to judge anyone's decision to take a different approach, because it's not for me to judge.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I sympathize with all of that. It's the reason we go to a fraternity parish. And it's not a decision we made lightly, and it's not a decision that we made without consequences socially
Yes.
and otherwise, right? And so, but we just couldn't stay where we were. Now, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I still return to this problem for me as a Catholic, that like our ecclesiology is dogmatically defined, right? So, I mean, just because something isn't promulgated ex cathedra, right?
Yeah.
It still means that in matters of, like, Vatican I explicitly says that in matters of not just faith and morals, but also jurisdiction and jurisprudence, that the Supreme Pontiff has immediate and supreme authority on all of these matters.
Of course.
So I just don't know how we get to a situation where we can make judgments that supersede his on pretty much any matter of ecclesiology.
Well, that would be true, but they're not making judgments on ecclesiology or on jurisprudence, saying, like, the Society of St. Pius X does not argue as an official position that a particular legal position is invalid. That's not, they don't do that.
Yeah. No, but I guess more so like the declaration of excommunication from John Paul II, for example, right? Like, to say that
Right.
that's invalid, it's like, well, what higher authority are you appealing to when the Supreme Pontiff makes a statement like that?
Well, it's been lifted, so they don't say that.
No, obviously.
Yeah.
So would you say that it was valid, though, for the time that it was there?
Well, here's what I'll say. Father Gerald Murray, he's a EWTN contributor, very well-known conservative Catholic. He did his doctoral dissertation arguing that the excommunications of Marcel Lefebvre were invalid.
Okay.
And he passed, got his PhD, or whatever you call it for canon law, and got the highest grade from a pontifical university in Rome.
Okay.
What does this tell us? He's not judging the Pope. He's not saying that I know better than the Pope because I'm so special. He's just like, the law is the law, and I'm a lawyer. I mean, again, this is why Supreme Court judges, they have lawyers that do their research and put together their arguments.
Yeah.
So no one's judging the Pope insofar as, like, he doesn't have the authority, but it's just a debatable thing.
But you're saying that
yeah.
when he exercises that authority, it wasn't validly exercised? Is that right?
No, he didn't exercise the authority. This is another thing too. This is a misunderstanding of what type of excommunication it is.
Okay.
So a late sententia excommunication is not the same as a ferende sententia sententia excommunication. What's the difference? Late sententia is, by the act itself, you excommunicate yourself. Ferende sententia is, because you did something egregious, I'm choosing to excommunicate you for a particular reason. That never happened. The statement was from Cardinal Gantin on July 1st, 1988, that Lefebvre had excommunicated himself, which is what late sententia means. In order for that to be true, it must meet the stipulations for what it would take to transgress that offense. It is totally reasonable for people to debate that, because it's not a declaration in a positive sense from the Pope.
Are you talking about the document Ecclesia Dei from John
No,
Paul II?
that came out the day after. That was not actually the declaration of excommunication. People don't know this.
Okay.
It was on July 1st. So the letter, this is what it was like. The letter from John Paul II was kind of like, it's like the Supreme Court puts out or a judge puts out a decision the day before.
Yeah.
And then the Prime Minister gives his opinion. Okay. Technically speaking, the Prime Minister does have an authority over the country, but just writing a letter about it does not make it into a valid penalty. It could be a valid penalty, but the letter does not make it so. There's a process that has to be gone through, and that process took place the day before. And it's.
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, again, as a Catholic who is not a canon lawyer, and certainly not a theologian either, at the end of the day, for me to render a judgment like this, as it applies to my own life, if I'm going to participate perhaps in an SSPX chapel or something like that, like, I have to still look at a document like Ecclesia Dei, in which the Pope says that they are excommunicated.
Not the SSPX, but 4 bishops.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah.
That's a big difference, right?
Sure.
Because people would say, well, the SSPX was excommunicated, and they weren't.
Well,
yeah.
But Lefebvre and the bishops that he consecrated, obviously.
Right.
Is what I mean.
Yep. Yeah. So,
like that to me, like I have to interpret that as being, okay, well, I trust the Pope's judgment on this, right? I mean, I might be able to find canon lawyers who say otherwise.
You find some pretty big ones that are, and these are not traditionalists. This has been dispute. There was one of the judges of the Roman Rota, the highest court in the church, Father Mayuli. He was from New Zealand. He wrote in 2000. It was an email that ended up being published. He was just responding to questions, and he just happened to be. He was actually a barrister in New Zealand in the secular courts, and a judge in the church. And he was a highly reputable man. And he just wrote, point by point, why this excommunication could not have been valid. It just didn't meet certain stipulations. And he even said the way that it was promulgated didn't even meet the way that it's supposed to be promulgated. A letter saying something has happened is not enough.
Yeah.
This is extremely confusing, though, isn't it? This is extremely confusing for Catholics, and that's the tragedy. So, all that being said, again, I think people should probably buy my book, not just to support me, but because I do go over this in detail. And it takes more, and this conversation has been wonderful, and I'm very thankful for it. And I'm actually, I was elated when you invited me because I knew, I liked the cut of your jib, and I thought that it would be good, and it has been, so this has been wonderful.
Good, thanks. Yeah.
And it's very courageous of you, because when you start being nice to the schismatics, the people get angry. But the excommunications, even if people believe that they were valid, which again, there are people who believe they weren't, and these people are not crazy rad trad schismatics. These are regular judges in the church.
Yeah.
But even if you believe they were, excommunication actually ends at death, because an excommunication is a medicinal penalty from people in the church militant, so it can't apply to those in the church suffering or the church triumphant. So Lefebvre's not excommunicated anymore. And assuming he died in a state of grace, he's in heaven like every other person in heaven.
Okay.
I will also say, if they were valid, they have been lifted, and they never applied to the priests. We have in our church the Byzantine Catholics, who were officially schismatic for 400 years.
Right.
Or however, it might longer, whatever the number was.
Yeah.
No one brings up the excommunications. Why would you? No one's saying that if you go to a Byzantine church, that you somehow are attached to something that happened at one time when there was a penalty.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to. It's not a whataboutism. I'm just trying to put it out there as it really, to me, I don't see why people harp on it, because if people believe the SSPX is disobedient and whatever, then show some obedience, my friends. And just say there are no penalties, so this is not a point of contention for me, because it's not a point of contention for Rome.
Yeah.
That would ironically be obedient.
Yeah, I guess the reason people do get hung up on it is because it's important to go through the history, right? As people who want to make these kinds of prudential decisions. And if it's true that they were validly excommunicated, well, then the question becomes, what were they excommunicated for? And it does seem to suggest that it was for disobedience and arguably schism, right? And this isn't a word that we've really gotten.
Sure.
We haven't jumped on it yet, and hopefully we can get to it here quickly. But if that's the case, then it seems like a pretty risky business to get involved with, and certainly for members who are part of the society, like the priests themselves, to operate without faculties to say mass, for example, or to operate within the jurisdiction of a valid bishop who they haven't been invited and they haven't been incarnated within that particular diocese, for example.
So I'll say this: you don't actually have to have faculties to say mass. You just have to not be suspended. So the fact that they've been given faculties for confessions means they're not suspended. So it doesn't. It's not actually necessary. That's again, these are ins and outs, but they actually really matter. Okay. As far as schism, the church has made it clear. The official authorities in the church have made it clear that there's no risk of schism. And in fact, Cardinal Castellan Hoyos, who was in charge of the Ecclesiae, which was in charge of the fraternity, society, all the other traditionalist communities, which has now been absorbed by the CDF. There's a letter that was published, and he was writing to Bishop Fillet, and he said, "In your community, I found no inkling of heresy or schism." And this was in 2007. So the people in the church who are in charge of making these decisions don't believe that there's a risk of schism. Even if it was believed at a time, it's just no longer the case. So I sympathize, but it's like, again, if we believe that the SSPX is in tricky waters because they don't follow what the church thinks, then the opposite is true as well. It's like, well, the church has made it very clear that we don't think there's a risk of schism, so we should just move on, you know?
Yeah.
It could also be the case that there was a belief that there was a risk of schism because there was a time when the positions of Marcel Lefebvre were extremely controversial. And as things have progressed, it just seems to be the positions of the average traditionalist now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we define our terms here a little bit too? Because,
Sure.
So if we're gonna go over to the real controversial bit of schism here, and you were right to point out at the beginning here that like that's a serious accusation. So I can understand why members of the society resent it when it's thrown around, especially haphazardly. It's pretty severe thing to be accused of. So as you know, St. Thomas Aquinas has definitions about schism, and it's also in canon law. But the most important thing to really define here is it schism or is it schism?
It's actually schism.
I prefer schism because it sounds a lot
too.
worse. It's a lot sharper. It's
like, did you watch The Office?
A little bit. No, well, a little bit back in the day.
Well, Dwight Schrute, he says there's R is one of the most menacing sounds. There's a reason why it's murder and not muck duck. Anyway, that's an inside joke for Office people. But schism is defined essentially as this is actually how John Paul II, because if we're talking about the SSPX, we should probably say what he thought about it because he's the Pope at the time.
Okay.
He pointed to canon law and how it's defined in the Catechism and its complete repudiation of the Roman primacy.
Okay, that's further than my understanding. Where does he say that?
It's Canon 751. He says that in Ecclesia Dei.
This is in the 1983 canon?
This is yeah.
Oh, okay.
But this is the part again. It's interesting that you say that. That's like, whoa, that's further than I would go. Exactly. That's John Paul II says they were guilty of the complete repudiation of the Roman primacy, and people were going. They prayed for the Pope during the Mass. Like, you can say that they did some bad things, but if they prayed for the Pope in the Mass, they are de facto recognizing he's the Pope and that they have to pray for him for liturgically. So it can't be a schism. Like, it can't be. So schism. There's a I use colloquially. I'll say, there's a little schism and a big schism. St. Paul talks about schism in I think it's Corinthians, and he says, "Let there be no schisms among you." He's not referring to groups that had set up their own separate juridical structures.
Right.
He was referring to divisions.
Division, yeah.
Schism means division. So there's a formal division. We set up our own church. There's an informal division of we're just not united. There are plenty of schisms in the church today.
Sure. Yeah.
And there have been forever.
Okay.
So I would say, yes, is there a schism in the church? And could someone make the argument that there's a schism between the SSPX and somebody else? Of course. There's a division between tradition and non-tradition, even without the society.
Yeah.
But does that mean the SSPX is schismatic in the sense of setting up a separate church? I don't think we can say that.
Okay. So the reason I say that that's going further than my understanding is because, well, I'm not familiar with that definition. The definition that I have read from canon law was the same as the one I had read in St. Thomas's Summa, and I don't have canon law in front of me, so I can't actually quote this. But maybe if we can't resolve that the disparity, we'll just ask people to go look this up themselves. But St. Thomas defines it as refusal to submit to the Supreme Pontiff, and my understanding is that canon law defines it the same way. So
yes, I can read it for you. I can read it.
Sure.
It says schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff. Or
sorry, are you reading St. Thomas?
Canon 751.
Okay.
Or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. But that's really important.
Right.
Because if the SSPX are in the church, then ironically it is a schismatical disposition to refuse communion with the members of the church subject to the Pope.
Right.
Which is why I just say, again, people disagree, but we, in a sense, we can just kind of sing Kumbaya and just go to different churches and be happy.
Sure.
Right? I mean, if they're in the church, they can't. You can't have faculties if you're not in the church. You can't.
No.
You can't. Here's the funny part, Brian. You can't even be excommunicated. You can't even be suspended if you're not in the church.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you can't have a
Yep.
penalty if you're not in the league. You know, if you're not in
Right.
the game, the referee can't give you a slap on the wrist.
Right.
So whatever one may think about them, they're in the church. You can't. This is undeniable.
Yep.
And the church does not judge otherwise. So if we should just sort of leave it at that.
Okay. I mean, I still get hung up on this definition though, because I mean, if we're looking at the history of Lefebvre, his refusal to abide by certain commands that came from Paul VI, and then from John Paul II, and then whether technically valid disciplines were and measures of discipline were issued against him, you still have to recognize that the Pope wanted things one way, and Lefebvre didn't agree and went another way. I mean, isn't that a fair assessment?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I just believe, like many, that as much greatness as there could be found in a Paul VI or John Paul II, there were still grave issues that were putting the faithful at a grave risk, and people believed there was a crisis that had to be acted upon. And
yeah.
I mean, we haven't even talked about. I mean, what would we do after Assisi? People. I mean, right? I mean, this is the pagan elephant in the room.
Sure.
Goodness gracious, if we were to read about something like Assisi in the Old Testament, we would expect the ground to open up and swallow all the participants.
Yeah.
It's amazing that Lefebvre didn't go further. That's one of the things I look at and I go, whoa, I can't imagine seeing Assisi. There's more we could talk about. But,
I mean, we're definitely living through a season of the church in which going up to the highest levels, like we've seen things happen that it's like, that's testing my understanding of what the Pope is capable of, I suppose. I'm less familiar with Assisi than I am more recent events, because I'm a little too young for all of that, and I haven't spent a lot of time with it. But I know that people have their objections to it. But no, I mean, I definitely sympathize with that. I think I want to say my instinct, but I guess I'll just say my position has always been that it's better for me to be obedient and wrong, as long as, again, I'm not committing a mortal sin of some kind, than it would be for me to disobey and be right. Because of, again, our dogmatic understanding of our ecclesiology, because of this very severe gravity of what St. Thomas calls a special sin. He calls schism a special kind of sin, right? Like I don't want to walk up to that line and see how close I can get to it, and so I try to run as far away from it as I can.
I agree with you, and I just want to read this other part of this canon here, because this is the double-edged sword. Canon 751 says, heresy is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after the reception of baptism of some truth which is to be believed by the divine and Catholic faith. Yeah. Schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion with members of the church subject to him. Yeah. So what happens when you're a bishop and you're being told to accept something that you always knew would be heresy? Yeah, well, it's a hypothetical, right? So
yeah, totally.
So your position is to edge sort of to one side of it, because you can reconcile that, and that's totally fine. Another position is, I'm convinced that they're and we should mention this quickly. Lefebvre put a dubia in about religious freedom to the Vatican, and what he received was objectively heretical in response. And there's a copy of it, and I cite it in my book, and it said, and this was 1987, and it said, the non-believer cannot be restrained in any way from practicing his faith, which is like by the state, which is 100% false. That's impossible, because I mean, your religion could be a religion where you murder people so that you can stop the murder. It's technically stopping your faith.
Or sacrificing children to Moloch or something.
Exactly.
Like that.
So he saw that and he just went, I submitted this. It was the document was given to him on behalf of Cardinal Ratzinger by an anonymous theologian. So you're right, but his position was, I'm now in a situation where I'm almost dead. He was dying of bowel cancer. He was 80 something. I've gone through all the possible channels, which is a testament to obedience. You wouldn't go through those channels if you didn't think the Pope was subject to them. Yeah. And now I'm at the point where I'm facing eternity, and my spiritual children are languishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm asking for help, and I'm asking for a lifeboat, and they're sending me a pool noodle in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And I would also just say one more thing as well. Yes, schism is refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff, but it doesn't mean that we must submit to the Supreme Pontiff in all things, no matter the circumstance. That would be against reason. So you could be, in theory, subject to the Roman Pontiff in principle, but the theologians of the Middle Age, of the era of the late scholastics, all talked about it'd be lawful to resist the Pope if he was destroying the church and things like that. I mean, these are, and these things are rare, but I believe that we've kind of come to one of those scenarios.
Yeah, I can appreciate in theory how there would be scenarios where you could conceivably disobey the person, but I mean, based on what Vatican I says about the supremacy of his authority going just beyond faith and morals and also to complete governance of the church, like I just don't know where there's a scenario beyond hypothetical. And I think we've gone way beyond hypothetical in the case of Lefebvre and some of his actions, where
well,
it just seems to me very obvious that he did disobey.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
But can I say something about Pastor Ternus? So we keep talking about the dogmatic ecclesiology. Well, that's another problem. Because Vatican II ecclesiology on the authority of the episcopacy seems in contrast to Pastor Ternus.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, arguably, yeah, it depends.
So I just mean, again, we get back to this place of which dogmatic ecclesiology?
Sure.
So it's not
but
the
this
job.
is kind of the beauty of what it means to be Catholic, right? Because people like you and I can look at the tradition, look at, dogmatic canons and things like that and say, well, this is what I think it's saying. But at the end of the day, we don't have to interpret the tradition. So just Protestants with Scripture, who will disagree about what Scripture is actually saying. The nice thing about the fact that Christ left us with an authoritative apostolic church that he preserves from error on these questions of interpretation, we also need someone to interpret the tradition for us as well as revelation. So when we have somebody who is a legitimate supreme authority, it's like, well, we have to abide by his interpretation of certainly matters that are dogmatic, but secondly, his commands on anything that's juridical as well, in terms of the governance
unless it would contradict the common good or the previous teaching.
No, I know, but that requires us to make that judgment. That puts me in the judgment seat of saying, well, he said something that contradicts the tradition, but I can't make that judgment.
Yeah, but you're not making. But I would say you're not making the judgment. You're saying that the judgment's already been made. By the tradition. So this is what St. Vincent of Lerins said. He was talking about during the Arian crisis, and it was a time where they were dealing with something like this.
Yeah.
And he said, in a time of turbulence, you just go with what was always believed, and you let the other ones sort it out, but you don't contravene what you believe to be true.
Okay.
It's not relativism like I believe to be true because I have a novel position. It's I'm reading the syllabus of errors.
Sure.
And then I'm looking at this other thing, and this thing says anathema.
Yeah.
This thing says do the anathema.
Right.
I'm going to go with not doing the anathema and just try to get to heaven. We're not judging the Pope who says the different thing. We're just saying your predecessor says something different, and there has to be continuity of the office for all time. It's not like Mormonism, where the leader can make up a new teaching because it's a revelation. So this is a very acceptable traditional position, and we can hold this as lay people. Because we have to. I mean, we have a reason and an intellect. And as long as we don't separate ourselves from the union of the church by objectively rejecting the submission of the Pope, objectively rejecting the faith, and so on, it's not for us to sort out the rest. So people make their own decisions, and that's what they do.
Yeah. I mean, that does seem like splitting hairs to me, but that's okay. We can kind of move on from this. My headphones have died in one ear, so we'll have to wrap it up here.
Yes.
But I appreciate your generosity of time and the time you've taken to have this conversation. And I think it's been fruitful and helpful for those who have been watching as well. I will say that I have been sympathetic to Lefebvre as a person of history and some of his actions in the past, and to whatever degree I've been familiar with him. But in preparation for this interview, I did come across a quote from him, which I was really surprised by. It seemed out of character for him, where he said, so this was in the lead up, or this was right after the agreement that had been made with the Vatican, and I think it was 1988 that you had alluded to earlier there with Ratzinger, where it seemed like the Vatican was giving them what they wanted, and then he said, no, we're not gonna move forward with this agreement. And And then he said in this quote, even if they give us the Missal of 1962, even if they give us a bishop, even if they give us all the things that we're asking for, they are diametrically opposed to us. He said, Rome is in apostasy, Rome has lost the faith. And he said it like 3 times, which that last part I was really surprised by. Did he maintain that? Is that still the position of the society, or did I misunderstand that? Is there more context to that, or like what's your take on that?
He was objectively correct that Rome was diametrically opposed because Rome is still opposed to tradition.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's just a statement of fact. As far as Rome being in apostasy, we also have to understand that priests and people who preach obviously use hyperbole. But yes, it looked like Rome was in apostasy after Assisi.
Okay.
It just did. I mean, this is the this is the perception, and I have souls under me, and they're looking for a pastor, and they go to their pastor of their diocese and they ask for bread, and he gives them stones.
Okay.
The perception of how Rome has been for a lot of years has looked like an apostasy.
Yeah.
But just, I mean, take off our canon law glasses for a second and say, I know what Catholicism looks like. Why does Pope Francis have a Cirque du Soleil festival around him with half-naked women?
Right.
That happened, right? And the same things happened with John Paul II. I mean, there was other scandals.
Yep.
And it's not just about the Pope. Rome is the whole shebang. So, you have a curia that's adopting Freemasonic ideals. You have, good bishops and priests being, whacked on the head like whack-a-mole every time they pop up. And, the Maciels of the world are promoted, one of the greatest monsters in the history of the church, the McCarricks of the world. The perception is that Rome is in apostasy. This does not mean the church has defected, but we do know that it is predicted in Scripture that there would be a great apostasy, and that would include many members of the church. So, I mean, again, it's a jarring statement to just hear it as a one-off.
Yeah.
But in the context of living through it, I think it was exactly what people felt was happening.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. Kennedy, thanks a lot. Thanks again for your time, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
I really appreciate it, Brian, and I have to say you are one of the only people who has had the kindness and sort of real. We use this word dialogue so much now, don't we?
Accompaniment.
But I've enjoyed this encounter and our dialogue so much. I really mean that, and I'm really appreciative of it. And may God reward you for it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kennedy. Until next time.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we intranet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.